The clock on the microwave read 6:42 in the morning when the sound began. It was a low crunching, a sound that didn't belong here, not on my land. It was the sound of gravel being compressed by rubber tires. The sound of something heavy rolling where it should us. I was at the kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee mug. A simple, ceramic thing my late wife Eleanor had bought at a craft fair 20 years ago. The morning sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the hayfield, and the world was quiet as it should be. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the electronic beep-beep of a car being locked. I dried my hands on a dish towel, walked to the back door, and looked out across the porch. There she was, Brenda Miller, in the flesh. President of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, self-appointed queen of our little corner of the world. Her car, a white luxury SUV that was always far too clean, was parked 20 yards inside my property line. It sat squarely on the access path I had graded last fall, its left front tire crushing the small orange flag of a survey stake I had driven into the ground just last week. She had a purple yoga mat tucked under her arm, and was wearing an outfit so bright it seemed to insult the quiet greens and browns of the morning. She spread the mat on the grass at the edge of my field, took a deep, performative breath, and began to stretch. I didn't move for a full minute. I just watched. I watched as she claimed a piece of my land as her personal yoga studio, under the mistaken impression that her will was a substitute for a deed. I had owned this 10-acre parcel for 30 years, long before the first foundation for the Oak Creek subdivision was ever poured. My house sat on a separate 2-acre lot adjacent to it. The field was mine. The path was mine. The crushed survey stake was mine. I poured myself another cup of coffee. The dark liquid, a stark contrast to the white porcelain of the mug, and walked out onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked faintly under my weight. I stopped at the bottom and waited. It took her another 2 minutes to notice me. She was in some kind of pose, one leg twisted behind her head, when her eyes finally focused on the silent figure standing by the house. She untangled herself with a grunt and stood up, placing her hands on her hips. It was her power pose, the one she used at HOA meetings right before. She was about to fine someone for having a non-compliant garden gnome, a "Can I help you?" She called out, her voice sharp and ringing with manufactured authority. I took a slow sip of my coffee, "You are on my property." "Brenda," she laughed. It was a short, barking sound, devoid of humor. "Do not be ridiculous, Arthur. This is community open space." Everyone knows that." The community does not have open space," I said, my voice even. The developer did not allocate any. What the community has are commonly held parcels, managed by the HOA, which are clearly defined on the plat map filed with the county. This is not one of them. This is Lot B, Block 4, parcel number 73-8. It is private property. It is my property. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture meant to erase deeds and titles. "I have been doing my morning yoga here for 3 years. It's part of the community. Aesthetic. Skata. Deta's grandfathered in." She took a step toward me, her face hardening. "And I'll thank you not to harass me. As president of the board, I could have you fined for homeowner aggression." I looked at her expensive, ridiculous car parked on my land. I looked at the little plastic flag of the survey stake, now a crumpled rag mashed into the dirt under her tire. That stake had cost me $4.75. I had the receipt. I kept the receipts for everything. "Move your car, Brenda." "I will not," she said, her voice rising. "This is my spot." "Nah. And if you have a problem with it, you can file a formal complaint with the Architectural Review Committee. I'll be sure to review it at my earliest convenience." She turned her back on me then, a clear sign that the conversation in her mind was over. She walked back to her purple mat and prepared to resume her routine. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked back into my house, closing the door quietly behind me. I went back to the kitchen window and watched as she contorted herself into another pose, a smug little smile on her face. She had no idea. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet, gray-haired widower in a faded flannel shirt, a man who kept to himself. She didn't see the man who had spent 40 years as a professional civil engineer, specializing in land use, zoning, and hydrology. She did see the man who had designed subdivisions just like this one, who had written covenants, who had testified as an expert witness in dozens of boundary disputes. She had just threatened to fine me for standing on my own porch and telling her to get off my land. She had no idea she had just declared war. More importantly, she had no idea what that specific patch of grass, the one her car was currently parked on, was for. She had just buried the only thing keeping her street dry. But before I get to the excavator and the sheriff's deputy, I should probably explain how we got here. It did not start with a yoga mat and a crushed survey stake. It started, as these things so often do, with a little bit of power in the hands of the wrong person. It started with beige paint and the precise angle of a basketball hoop. I'm 62 years old. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago. We bought this land together 30 years back, when it was nothing but fields and forest. We built the house ourselves, with help from a few good contractors. It was our sanctuary. Eleanor loved the field. She wanted to keep it wild, a place for the deer and the foxes. When the developer came along 10 years later, with plans for the Oak Creek subdivision, I was wary. I was working full-time then, as a partner at a large engineering firm. I knew the developer's game. I had been on the other side of that table 100 times. I sold them the 80 acres that would become Oak Creek, but I kept this 10-acre parcel and our 2-acre homestead separate. The deed was ironclad. The survey was precise. I drew the lines myself. On paper, my property was a legal island, entirely distinct from the sea of the HOA that surrounded it. For years, it was. I am, by nature, a quiet man. My work required meticulous attention to detail, patience, and an understanding that the laws of physics and the laws of man are equally unforgiving. You can't argue with a floodplain. You can't negotiate with a zoning ordinance. You can only understand the rules and work within them. It was a good life. After Eleanor died, the quiet of this place became even more important. It was filled with her memory. I tended her gardens. I kept the field mowed. Just enough to keep the brush down. I lived a simple, orderly life. I avoided conflict. I believe that most problems can be solved, or better yet avoided, with clear communication and a shared understanding of the facts. Brenda Miller did not share this belief. Brenda moved in about 6 years ago. She was a force of nature, charismatic, in a sharp-edged way. She quickly involved herself in the HOA, and 2 years ago, she was elected president on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the standards that make Oak Creek a premier community. What that meant in practice was a reign of petty tyranny. She walked the neighborhood with a clipboard and a tape measure. Mrs. Gable down the street was fined $50 because her mailbox, which was the same model and color it had been for a decade, was apparently now a shade of beige that was no longer on the approved palette. The Henderson family was cited because their Sonas basketball hoop was tilted at a 5-degree angle, which Brenda claimed was a visual nuisance. She had a knack for interpreting the HOA covenants in the most draconian way possible, and when the covenants did not support her, she simply invented rules and claimed they were based on Board Resolution SAW, that no one could ever seem to produce a record of. She was a performative tyrant. Her power was derived not from the documents she was supposed to uphold, but from the reluctance of decent people to engage in constant draining conflict. Most people just paid the fines. It was easier. It was cheaper than hiring a lawyer to fight a $50 citation. They were busy with their jobs, their kids, their lives. They just wanted to be left alone. I understood that. I was the same. My first run-in with her was over the color of the trim on my garden shed. It was a dark forest green, a color Eleanor had picked out. It had been that color for 15 years. Wah. Brenda sent me a notice, a crisp, professionally printed letter on HOA letterhead, informing me that my shed was in violation of Article R4, Section 2C of the Covenants, and that I had 30 days to repaint it to an approved neutral earth tone. The fine for non-compliance was $100 a month. I knew for a fact that Article 4, Section 2C pertained to satellite dishes, not outbuildings. I also knew that the architectural guidelines had no jurisdiction over my property, as it was explicitly excluded in the master deed. I could have painted my shed bright pink with purple polka dots, and there was nothing she could legally do about it. My first instinct was to write her a letter, citing the relevant documents, and end the matter, but then I hesitated. I had seen what she did to people who challenged her. She didn't just disagree, she targeted them. She would find a dozen other imaginary violations. She would make their lives miserable. And at the time, I just did not have the energy for that fight. I was still grieving Eleanor. The quiet was too precious. So I made a calculated decision. I did not repaint the shed. I let the 30 days pass. The first $100 fine arrived in the mail. I wrote a check. I mailed it in. The next month, another fine arrived. I wrote another check. On paper, I was a compliant, if delinquent, homeowner. But what I was really doing was buying peace. And I was starting a file. I made a new folder in my filing cabinet. I labeled it HOA. Inside, I placed a copy of the violation notice and the carbon copy of my check. Every notice, every letter, every check, every email newsletter from the HOA that mentioned some new, arbitrary rule Brenda had invented, I printed it out and put it in the folder. I was paying her to leave me alone, but I was also meticulously documenting her overreach. I kept the receipts. The Brenda file, as I began to call it in my mind, grew thicker. It was a quiet, methodical act of protest, a gathering of evidence for a battle I hoped I would never have to fight. But my professional life had taught me one thing above all else. Hope is not a strategy. Preparation is. After the confrontation over her yoga spot, I retreated to my office. A room at the back of the house, overlooking the field. The walls are lined with books, engineering manuals, survey texts, volumes on property law. My old drafting table, a magnificent oak thing from the 1952, sits in the center of the room, though I mostly use a computer with CAD software now. I sat down in my worn leather chair and looked out the window. Brenda was gone. Her SUV was no longer scarring my access path. But the crushed survey stake was still there, a tiny monument to her arrogance. She had torn up the map, metaphorically speaking. So I decided it was time to show her the territory, in excruciating, legally binding detail. The first step was the formal warning. Arguing with Brenda in person was pointless. It was her word against mine, and her word was louder. The law, however, requires a paper trail. I drafted a letter. It was polite, professional, and unambiguous. It was addressed to Brenda Miller, in her official capacity as HOA president, and to the other 4 members of the board of directors. In the letter, I stated the facts. I identified the time and date of the trespass. I cited the parcel number of my property. I explained in simple terms that her assertion that it was a community open spacia was factually incorrect. To support this, I attached 2 documents. The first was a certified copy of my deed for the 10-acre parcel, which I had ordered from the county recorder's office months ago for just such a contingency. The second was a high-resolution scan of the official subdivision plat map, also from the county records. With my property clearly outlined in red, the boundary lines were not a matter of opinion, they were a matter of legal record. I concluded the letter with a formal cease and desist notice, demanding that she and any other resident she may have misled refrain from entering my property. I stated that any future trespass would be documented and reported to the sheriff's office. I printed 5 copies, 1 for each board member. I sent them via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was critical. It meant they could not claim they never received it. They would have to sign for it. On paper, they would be officially notified. The cost of postage and certification was $28.50. I put the receipt in the Brenda file. A week later, I received an email. It was the minutes from the monthly HOA board meeting. I was still on the mailing list. I scrolled down and there it was. Under the heading, A New Business, the minutes read. President Miller presented a letter received from homeowner Arthur Covington regarding access to the field adjacent to his property. President Miller clarified for the board that this area has historically been used by residents as open space and that Mr. Covington's claims are without merit. The board voted unanimously to disregard the letter and take no further action. Disregard the letter. She had presented my carefully constructed legal notification, my deed, my plat map, as a mere complaint from a disgruntled homeowner. And she had gotten the board to formally vote to ignore it. She had no idea what she had just done. She had just created an official record of the HOA, HOA. If someone were to get hurt on my property, after she had encouraged them to be there and had formally disregarded my warning, the liability would be astronomical. And it would land squarely on the HOA's insurance policy and, by extension, on every homeowner who paid dues. I printed the email and the attached minutes. I highlighted the relevant section with a yellow marker. I stapled the green certified mail receipts to the printout and placed the entire package carefully into the file. Her arrogance was becoming my greatest asset. It was clear that a letter was not enough. She had dismissed the documents. She did not believe in paper. She believed in power. It was time to escalate. It was time to stop being a quiet neighbor and start being a professional engineer. I went to the large flat file cabinet in the corner of my office. In the bottom drawer under a roll of old blueprints were the Mylar originals, the construction plans for the entire Oak Creek subdivision. I had been a consultant for the developer 20 years ago, brought in to solve a drainage problem. As part of my fee, I had retained a full set of the final as-built drawings. I pulled them out. The sheets were large and crackled as I unrolled them on my drafting table. The smell of old paper and ink filled the room. I spent the next 2 hours studying the hydrology plans, the grading, the location of every storm drain, every culvert, every retention pond. I knew what I was looking for. I found it on sheet C7, a stormwater management plan. A thick blue line, labeled a 36-inch reinforced concrete pipe, ran directly from the storm drains on Brenda Street, cut diagonally across my 10-acre field, and emptied into the creek at the far end of my property. This was the primary storm surge culvert for the entire western half of the subdivision. And right alongside it, indicated by a dotted line, was a 20-foot wide notation, A County Drainage Easement and Maintenance Access. The access path she had parked her SUV on wasn't just a path I had graded. It was the official, legally recorded access route for county vehicles to service the main artery of the neighborhood's drainage system. My heart beat a little faster. This was more than just trespassing. This was obstruction. I picked up the phone and called Frank Peterson. Frank is a licensed surveyor, a man I have worked with for 30 years. He's more meticulous than I am, if that is possible. Frank, I said. Arthur, I need a favor. Can you pull the full title report and easement record for parcel 73-8? Frank called me back the next day. Father, you have got something interesting here. He said a standard drainage easement filed in 98, dedicated to the county, but there is an addendum. It looks like the county got a state infrastructure grant to upsize that pipe back in 2003. There's grant covenant attached to the easement. He paused. The covenant specifies that the maintenance access route must remain unobstructed and passable by heavy equipment at all times. It also states that any obstruction can result in the county levying fines against the property owner of record. That is, you, by the way. I smiled. Thanks, Frank. That is exactly what I needed to know. This was the bombshell. This was the key. Brenda's morning yoga routine was not just a simple trespass. Her encouragement of others to use the area as a parka wasn't just a lie. It was an active and ongoing violation of a recorded county easement and a state grant covenant. The HOA, by formally sanctioning this behavior after I had put them on notice, had assumed the liability for it. She thought this was a fight about a patch of grass. She had no idea it was about $1 million piece of public infrastructure buried 6 feet beneath it. The game had changed. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was enforcing a county ordinance. I went back to my desk and got to work. My next step was to create a situation that would force a confrontation, but on my terms. With an official witness present, I called the County Public Works Department. I explained that I was the owner of parcel 73-8 and that I had concerns about potential blockages in the primary drainage culvert that ran through my property given the heavy summer rains we'd had. I requested a routine inspection and clean-out of the culvert inlet and outlet. This was my right as the property owner and a prudent step to protect my own land from flooding. The clerk on the phone was very helpful. She scheduled a crew for the following Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock. She gave me a work order number. I thanked her and wrote it down. On Tuesday morning, I was up at 6. I made my coffee and sat on the porch, waiting. At 7:30, just as I expected, Brenda's white SUV crunched down my access path. She got out, spread her purple mat, and began her routine. She gave my house a defiant glance, a little smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought my silence was surrender. At precisely 8 o'clock, I heard the rumble of a heavy diesel engine. A large yellow backhoe, mounted on a flatbed truck from the County Public Works Department, turned onto my street. It pulled up to the entrance of the access path and stopped. 2 men in bright orange vests got out. One of them, the foreman, walked toward the house, a clipboard in his hand. Brenda stopped her yoga mid-pose, her eyes wide. This was not part of her tranquil morning. The foreman saw me on the porch. Mr. Covington, he called out. That is me, I said, walking out to meet him. We're here for the culvert inspection. Work order 942B, said, showing me the clipboard. Right on time, I said. The inlet is just up this path about 100 yards in. It was then that Brenda seemed to find her voice. She marched over to us, her face a mask of indignation. What is the meaning of this? You canna bring that thing in here, she screeched, pointing at the backhoe. The foreman, a big man with a weathered face, looked at her, then at me, confused. Mom, we have a work order to inspect the county drainage easement. This is a park. Ita's community property, Brenda insisted, her voice rising in pitch. You have no right I am the president of the Homeowners Association, and I am ordering you to leave. The foreman looked back at me, one eyebrow raised. I just gave him a calm, steady look. I didn't need to say a thing. Brenda wasn't done. She pulled out her phone. I am calling the sheriff. I am calling the sheriff. You are trespassing and destroying private property. She stabbed at the screen with her finger. Excellent, I said quietly, mostly to myself. Right on schedule, a sheriff's deputy arrived 15 minutes later. He was young, with a crisp uniform and a serious expression. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Brenda immediately descended on him, a torrent of words pouring out. She explained, with dramatic hand gestures, that this was a cherished community green space, that I was a disgruntled homeowner with a grudge, and that I had hired this construction crew to illegally excavate the land to spite her. She was playing the role of the besieged community leader protecting her flock from a dangerous madman. The deputy listened patiently, his face impassive. When she finally paused for breath, he turned to me. Sir, can I get your side of the story? I did not launch into a long explanation. I did not raise my voice. I believe that in moments of conflict, the person with the most paper usually wins. I held out 3 items for the deputy to see. Deputy, I said. My name is Arthur Covington. This is my driver's license, confirming my address. This is a laminated copy of the county plat map for this area. As you can see, this entire 10-acre parcel is my property, separate from the HOA. And this, I said, handing him the final piece of paper, is the official, stamped work order from the County Public Works Department for a routine inspection of the county drainage easement that runs through my land. The deputy took the papers. He looked at my ID. He studied the map, his finger tracing the boundary line that clearly separated my land from the subdivision. Then he read the work order, his eyes lingering on the official county seal. He looked from the papers in his hand to Brenda's SUV, which was parked directly in the middle of the access path, blocking the backhoe. He looked at Brenda, who was standing there with her arms crossed, expecting him to arrest me. Then he looked back at me. A flicker of understanding, and perhaps a little bit of pity, crossed his face. He handed my documents back to me. He then turned to Brenda. His voice was polite but firm, the kind of voice that leaves no room for negotiation. Maham, he said, based on the documents Mr. Covington has provided. He is the legal owner of this property. And this is a legitimate, county-authorized work crew. You are currently on private property, and your vehicle is obstructing their access. I need you to move your car. Now the color drained from Brenda's face. But I'm the HOA president. This is always been open space, she stammered. Mom. This is not an HOA matter, the deputy said, his patience clearly wearing thin. A civil matter between a property owner and a trespasser. And right now, it is also a county matter. Because you are interfering with a public works crew, you can move your vehicle, or I can have it towed at your expense. It has your choice. For a moment, I thought she was going to refuse, to push it to the point of no return. The arrogance in her eyes warred with the panic. But the deputy's unwavering stare won out. Defeated, she stalked over to her SUV, got in, backed it out onto the street, spraying gravel as she went. She didn't drive away. She parked at the curb and watched. Her face, a thundercloud. The deputy tipped his hat to me. Looks like you've got it handled from here, sir. Let us know if there are any more problems. Thank you, deputy, I said. Could I trouble you for your name and the incident report number, please, for my records? He gave me a small, knowing smile. He understood completely. He knew this was that over. He gave me his business card. The report will be filed by the end of my shift, he said. He got back in his patrol car and drove away. The public works foreman just shook his head. Some people, he muttered. He motioned to his driver, and the big backhoe rumbled to life, crawling slowly up my access path to begin its work. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was just entering a new phase. I took the deputy's card and placed it in my file. It was another piece of the puzzle, another stone in the foundation of the case I was building. The story of the deputy and the backhoe spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By that evening, my little act of procedural resistance had become the talk of Oak Creek. I was sitting on my porch enjoying the evening quiet when I saw a figure walking hesitantly up my driveway. It was my neighbor, George Henderson, the man whose Sona's basketball hoop had earned him a citation. He was a retired accountant, a quiet man who, like me, valued his peace. Brenda had fined him for at least half a dozen different things over the last year. He stood at the bottom of my porch steps, twisting a baseball cap in his hands. Arthur," he said, his voice low. "I heard what happened this morning. I wanted to say thank you. Someone needed to stand up to her, she was on my land." "George," I said. "I didn't have much of a choice." He shook his head. "No. You did what the rest of us were too afraid to do. We just pay the fines. We just want to be left alone, but she keeps pushing." He took a deep breath. "Look, there's something you should know. I was on the finance committee for a while, before I resigned. I couldn't stand working with her." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "She's been using the HOA's money for herself." I leaned forward in my chair. What do you mean, the landscaping budget?" George said, the words coming out in a rush now. She had the HOA's landscape contractor do a whole new set of plantings around her own house. New shrubs, mulch, a stone border, cost over $2,000. She submitted the invoice as a common area beautification project. Phase 1, I saw the invoice. It didn't list an address. I asked her about it, and she told me it was for the front entrance. I knew it was a lie because I had driven by her house that morning and seen the crew working there. When I pushed her on it, she had me removed from the committee. He looked miserable. I still have a copy of the invoice, and I took pictures of the work at her house the day it was done. I was too scared to do anything with them. "But you know what you're doing." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to me. Inside was a copy of the landscaping invoice and 2 photographs. One showed a landscaping crew installing boxwoods in front of Brenda's very recognizable house. The other was a close-up of the invoice, clearly showing the charge to the Oak Creek HOA. This was no longer about trespassing. This was evidence of potential embezzlement. Fiduciary malfeasance. It was a crime. "George," I said, my voice serious. "This is very important. Are you willing to testify to this if it comes to it?" He nodded, his jaw set. "Yes. I am tired of being bullied." I took the envelope and placed it on the small table next to me. "Thank you, George. You did the right thing." After he left, I sat there for a long time, the weight of that envelope palpable. A fearful ally had just handed me a weapon far more powerful than a plat map. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. My first call was to Carol Peterson, the HOA treasurer. She was a young mother who had reluctantly taken the position because no one else wanted it. I knew from casual conversation that she was terrified of Brenda. I explained what George had told me and the evidence he had provided. "SEPA." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I knew it," she finally whispered. "She approves all the invoices herself. She just tells me what checks to sign." She told me if I ever questioned her authority, she'd make my life a living hell. My second call was to another board member, a man named David Chen. He was a reasonable person, who I knew had been overruled by Brenda on several occasions. I told them both the same thing. I laid out the facts, the trespassing, the official notification. They had ignored the sheriff's report, the potential liability for obstructing the county easement, and now the evidence of financial misconduct. I told them that a special meeting needed to be called to present this information to the entire community and to hold Brenda accountable. I was no longer acting alone. A coalition was forming, a quiet rebellion of the reasonable. News that a special meeting was being called, and why, sent Brenda into a panic. Her control was slipping. Her narrative was falling apart. So, she did what bullies always do when they feel threatened. She escalated. She made one last, desperate and monumentally stupid move. 3 days before the scheduled meeting, a process server showed up at my door. He handed me a thick legal document. It was a lawsuit. Brenda Miller and the Oak Creek HOA were suing Arthur Covington for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were demanding $100,000 in damages. It was a classic SELAP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. It was designed to intimidate, to bury me in legal fees, to shut me up. She had hired the Oz law firm to sue me on her behalf. I read the document, a faint smile on my face. I looked at the signature page. It was signed by Brenda Miller as president of the HOA. She had used community funds to sue a member of the community for exposing her own misconduct. It was the final nail in her own coffin. She had no idea. She had just taken a neighborhood dispute and dropped it into the formal evidence-based world of the legal system. She had invited a man who treated documentation as a religion into a courtroom. She thought she was delivering a death blow. In reality, she had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. I said, Aidas. Time, I'm sending you a file. The community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. Word of the lawsuit had spread. Brenda's supporters, a small but vocal clique of homeowners who benefited from her favoritism, sat in the front rows looking smug. The rest of the room was filled with a tense, expectant energy. George Henderson sat in the second row, giving me a nervous but determined nod. Carol, the treasurer, and David, the other board member, sat at the main table, their faces grim. Brenda sat in the center, radiating a defiant confidence. She thought the lawsuit had scared me into submission. I sat at a small table to the side with my lawyer, Ellen Croft. Ellen was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a demeanor so calm it was almost unnerving. She specialized in property and corporate law. In front of her was not a briefcase, but a single, thick, red accordion file. The Brenda file. It was organized into tabbed sections, each one a chapter in the story of Brenda's reign. Brenda, as president, called the meeting to order. She began with a speech. It was a masterful performance of victimhood. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her selfless dedication to the community. She talked about the thankless hours she spent working to protect our property values. Then she turned her attention to me. She did not use my name. She spoke of a certain individual, who refused to follow the rules, and who react with aggression and personal attacks, when held accountable. She spoke of being harassed on her own property, a blatant lie. But she delivered it with such conviction that her supporters murmured in sympathy. Tears welled in her eyes as she described the campaign of slander that had been waged against her, a campaign that had forced her and the board to take legal action to protect the integrity of our community. It was a breathtaking piece of theater. When she finished, there was scattered applause from the front rows. She looked at me, a triumphant smirk on her face. Then she said, "The floor is now open for discussion." Ellen stood up slowly. She walked to the podium. She did not look at Brenda. She addressed the room. "A good evening," she said, her voice calm and clear. My name is Ellen Croft. I am the legal counsel for Mr. Arthur Covington A." She paused, letting that sink in. "We are not here tonight to engage in a debate. We are here to present facts. These facts are supported by documents, all of which are a matter of public record." She reached back to our table, and I handed her the first section from the file. "A fact one," she said, holding up a document in a plastic sleeve. Mr. Covington is the sole and legal owner of the 10-acre parcel, commonly referred to as a field. Taking the next set of papers, on July 12th of this year, the HOA board was formally notified, via certified mail, that this is private property and that any entry constitutes trespassing. This is the letter that was sent, and these she said, holding up the little green cards, are the signed receipts from all 5 board members, including President Miller. You were, on paper, officially informed." Brenda started to speak, but Ellen held up a hand. "Please allow me to finish. We will have time for questions later." Brenda snapped her mouth shut. "A fact 3, Ellen went on, her rhythm steady and methodical. On August 7th, President Miller was found to be trespassing on this property and was asked to leave by a sheriff as deputy. This is a copy of the official incident report filed by that deputy, which confirms Mr. Covington is Count. The room was now dead silent. The murmuring had stopped. People were leaning forward in their seats. Ellen was systematically dismantling Brenda's narrative, piece by piece, with undeniable documented proof. "And now we come to the most serious issue," Ellen said, her tone becoming graver. The area where President Miller was parking her car, and where she has been encouraging other residents to gather, is not just private property. It is a legally recorded county drainage easement and maintenance access route. This is a copy of the easement record and the state grant covenant attached to it. The covenant requires this access to be unobstructed at all times. By encouraging residents to use this area, and by formally voting to disregard Mr. Covington's warning, this board, under President Miller's leadership, has knowingly and willfully violated a county ordinance and exposed every single homeowner in this association to catastrophic liability. If that culvert fails in a storm because it could not be serviced, the resulting flood damage would not be covered by your insurance. It would be on you. A wave of shock rippled through the room. People were looking at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They were beginning to understand the depth of Brenda's recklessness. But Ellen wasn't finished. She picked up the last folder. Finally, there is the matter of the lawsuit filed by the HOA against Mr. Covington. She looked directly at Brenda. Now a lawsuit filed using HOA funds by the HOA's lawyer to silence a homeowner for bringing these very issues to light. This is not only a gross misuse of your authority and a violation of your fiduciary duty, but it has opened this association to a countersuit. Ellen let that hang in the air for a moment. Then she delivered the final, devastating blow. Furthermore, we have evidence including sworn testimony from a former member of the Finance Committee and copies of invoices that suggests President Miller has misappropriated HOA funds for personal use. We have already forwarded this evidence to the County Prosecutor's Office for review. Filing a frivolous lawsuit to cover up embezzlement is a very, very serious matter. That was it. That was the moment. The look on Brenda's face was something I will never forget. Her mask of confident indignation did not just slip. It shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a sickly pale gray. Her eyes, which had been so full of fire and defiance, became blank, vacant pools of sheer, unadulterated panic. She understood. In that instant, she understood the totality of her ruin. She saw the legal fees, the criminal charges, the public humiliation, all of it, laid out before her like a map of her own destruction. She had built her kingdom on lies and intimidation, and a quiet man with a file folder had just leveled it to the ground. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just sat there, a hollowed-out shell of the tyrant she had been an hour before, as the entire community stared at her in stunned silence. The collapse was total. It was absolute, and it was silent. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and decisive. In the stunned silence that followed Elena's presentation, David Chen, the board member I had spoken to, found his voice. He made a motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Brenda Miller as president. Carol Peterson, the treasurer, seconded it without hesitation. The vote was 4-0, with Brenda abstaining, still sitting frozen in her chair. She was removed from the presidency on the spot. David was appointed interim president. The first official act of the new board, taken right then and there, was to vote to withdraw the lawsuit against me. The second was to issue a formal public apology. The third was to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 2 years. The room, which had been so tense, erupted in applause. Brenda's supporters, seeing their queen so thoroughly dethroned, quietly slipped out the back door. Brenda herself was eventually led out by her husband, looking like a sleepwalker. The legal consequences for her were severe. The county prosecutor did indeed open an investigation based on the evidence George Henderson and I provided. The audit uncovered not just the $2,000 landscaping bill, but nearly $15,000 in other questionable expenses, all personally approved by Brenda. She was charged with felony embezzlement. To avoid a trial, she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, was sentenced to 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The legal fees for her defense, combined with the restitution, forced her and her husband to sell their house. They moved away 6 months later. I never saw her again. My countersuit was settled quickly. The HOA's insurance company, not wanting any part of a lawsuit involving documented fiduciary malfeasance, paid my legal fees in full. Ellen and I declined to pursue any further damages. The point had been made. The community began to heal. The new board, with David at the helm, and George Henderson now elected to a vacant seat, was a breath of fresh air. They were transparent, reasonable, and fair. Their first project was to go through all of Brenda's fines and violations from the past 2 years. Nearly all of them were rescinded, and the money was refunded to the homeowners. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and suspicion lifted. People started talking to their neighbors again. The ridiculous rule about the shade of beige for mailboxes was struck from the books. The Henderson Boyas basketball hoop remained at its comfortable 5-degree tilt, and no one said a word. The signs Brenda had posted at the entrance to my access path, the ones that read a community open space, were taken down. Months passed. The seasons turned. The hay in my field grew tall, was cut and baled, and then the field lay fallow under the winter snow. Now it is spring again. I am sitting on my porch, just as I was that morning a year ago. The coffee in my mug is warm, and the air is cool and clean. Where the crushed survey stake once lay, there is now a simple, professional sign. Eda's made of carved wood, stained a dark walnut. It reads, in clean, simple letters, a private property. No trespassing, parcel 73B4. Etas, not aggressive, Ita's not angry. It is simply a statement of fact. It is a line on a map made real. Inside, on a shelf in my office, sits the red accordion file. I've thought about throwing it away, but I cannot bring myself to do it. It is a tangible object, a reminder that order is not a passive state. Sometimes it must be defended. It is a testament to the idea that the truth, when meticulously documented, is a powerful force. Ownership isn't just about a name on a deed. It is about stewardship. It is about responsibility. It is about stewardship. A toss about the quiet right to enjoy your own space, free from the encroachments of those who believe their desires outweigh your rights. Brenda's fundamental mistake was that she never understood the rules. She thought the rules were whatever she said they were. She saw them as a tool for control, something to be bent or invented to suit her will. She never grasped that real, lasting order comes from rules that are clear, consistent, and applied fairly to everyone. She believed in performance, in volume, in social pressure. I believe in physics, in surveys, in the law. On paper, her version of reality was a fantasy. On paper, my version was the truth. And in the end, the paper always wins. The quiet has returned to my corner of the world. Eidos, a deep, earned quiet. And it is very, very. I take another sip of my coffee and watch as a deer and her fawns step cautiously from the woods at the far edge of my field, and they are welcome here.